did not open it. All right, hold on. That was the wrong one. Okay. So, actually, let me see which one it's behaving with. Do do do. Channel. There it is. That one's live. Hello. Okay. So, just go ahead and close that just in case. As a reminder to everybody, the first paper is due, or first paper, final paper is due a week from today. So next Monday, final paper, for those of you that are going to do it. It's also going to be review day. And then our final exam is going to be the Monday after that. Our final is the last day of finals, unfortunately. It will be in here at 8:30, by the way, on the 28th. Now, I'll be in here from, it's 8:30 to 10:30. You got 2 hours to do it. You won't need the 2 hours. It'll be just like every other test you've had with me. For you online students, if you want to come in and physically take it, you can, I guess. But you probably should email me like ahead of time, because otherwise, I'm going to assume that you're going to take it online like you've been doing and just set it up online like I have. And those of you that are always physically here in person, just come in on the 28th and take it. If there's any scheduling issues for those of you in here, I'll also be here the previous Thursday and Friday for my other classes, if you want to go ahead and get your test done early. So you can do that. But I'll be here, yes. Yes. But I'll also, like I said, I'll also be here the previous Thursday and Friday with my other classes. So if the 28th doesn't work for you, I'll be here before that. Also, I've actually got a number of students in my Tuesday, Thursday, and Monday, Wednesday class that are going to be gone that next week. So they're actually going to be here the 28th with you guys taking their other exams. So it's not just going to be the 5 of you, but it shouldn't affect you guys at all. I mean, it's just an exam. So that's all I can think. Any questions or clarifications on anything? So paper next Monday, review next Monday, final the Monday after that, which again is just going to be test 3. It's not going to be any bigger or different or anything from anything else we've had. So yeah. Also, the final is going to be on the previous 3 chapters. This and the next chapter are just me wanting to finish up the material. So I'm going to go over it really quickly. You don't need this for the final. Today is just for me. And also, if you want to come in next Tuesday for movie day, this helps us move from the end of World War I to the end of World War II, which is to say the Cold War, because the movies are Cold War movies. And I don't like ending with World War I and then doing Cold War movies, because I'm OCD like that. So I gotta move the timeline forward. All right. So let's briefly go over the interwar era, which, as I like to tell my American history students, we don't have a Roaring Twenties and a Great Depression era. We have a everything's terrible for like 20 years era in European history. And actually, the start here is something that, for example, I doubt many of you have been able to get your hands on the book because the book's been out of print for like 2 years now, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to get a better textbook. But the subtitle for our textbook, well, the title for the book is Mini Europe's Choice and Chance in Western Civilization, which is wordy, verbose, if you will. My history book, when I was taking history back in undergrad, the subtitle was The Search for Stability, which is a good, simple way to look at really history overall, but especially European history, because there's so much like times of chaos and warfare, and then people are like, okay, we're tired of this. Like, we're willing to go with this king that maybe doesn't have the best of intentions, but he's willing to give us stability. So, like, going as far back as, like, the Greeks or the Romans, even, like, the emperors of Rome, it's like, okay, maybe this guy's crazy, but he's willing to, like, give us stability. And then, obviously, with the stuff we're going to be looking at in this era, with like some of the dictators, like you wonder, like, why would they be willing to give up so much of their freedoms? Because they were tired of what they had and the chaos, and these people promised them stability and safety. So that's what we're looking at here. So everyone was looking for some kind of stability after World War I, or the Great War, again, as it was called in England. All combatants were in economic shambles, the victors in massive debt to the U.S., the losers, especially Germany, owing huge sums to the victors, which they had no way of repaying because, again, the countries were economically and often physically destroyed. Stunted agricultural output because, well, when you fight a war across vast swaths of territory, it doesn't make for good growing land. I mean, I told you guys last chapter that like there's whole regions of France still today where like the water is poisoned and you can't go there because there's probably still unexploded ordnance from literally World War I. It's too dangerous. So many countries rejected liberal democracy. They felt like it was too weak to keep the peace. They embraced totalitarianism. This eschewed freedom for strong authoritarian rule that would allow for faster change. They felt like all this endless debating and just talking about things wasn't allowing for change to happen fast enough. Now, all this is happening in Western Europe. Over in Russia, where that's not a concern, they're fighting each other. The Red Army, headed by Leon Trotsky, was moving against the White forces, which is to say liberals and Tsarist loyalists, and this was worse than World War I in Russia. The Red Army was quickly growing in size, bolstered by indoctrination and promises of a workers' paradise. The U.S., Great Britain, and France sent about 15,000 men in through Archangel, which is a place that usually isn't frozen. They were only there about a year because the fighting was really bad, and they just decided they didn't feel like fighting anymore. They just fought World War I. Japanese forces landed at Vladivostok and stayed until 1922, but they also departed and left the white forces to their fate. yeah, it was extremely bad. Border regions like Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Siberia, because, well, the cities were largely taken by the Soviets early on. Um, about 10 million people died. Now, again, overall in World War I want to say between something like between 2 and 5 million people died. And in this civil war, like double that, due to the fighting and the starvation that followed, because again, they were fighting in like border regions and across like farmland. They burned a lot of stuff to like starve out the rebels, which also starved out the people living there. It was extremely, extremely brutal. Like again, our worst war in terms of casualties is still our Civil War, and that was like 500,000 people, like 500,000, 600,000, which is still terrible. Like I'm not going to say, oh, it's just that many, but like 500,000, and in Russia it's like, oh yeah, 10 million people. Just yeah. So this is just some of the fighting during the Civil War. Again, there were a lot of border regions that were still under Tsarist control, and then the Soviets moved in and wiped them out. And that's why a lot of the regions have a lot of that's not even this, why they have a lot of anti-Soviet and now anti-Russia bias. Because it gets worse. It somehow gets worse than 10 million people dying in a civil war. Because that was like, in a war, that's at least like a conflict. It somehow gets worse than that. But, let's get into the details. So, the invention of the idea of socialism and then eventually communism, Marx and Engels had a lot to say about overthrowing a capitalist system, but not much about what to do afterwards. It's like, oh yeah, you go in, you have a workers rise up, and then they have a workers' paradise. Like, great. What does that mean? So Lenin was in charge post, World War I. He experimented with a couple of different systems, but they weren't really like hardline communist. Had the state seize control over private businesses to pay for the nation's debt. Got rid of the Romanov line in July of 1918. That was the whole, again, the Anastasia thing, which isn't entirely accurate. They created the special secret police, known as the Cheka, that was just a continuation of the Tsarist secret police. I mean, Russia's always had a secret police that, were waiting to kick your door down and drag you off to Siberia re-education camps. Known as the gulags. That's where you went if you were not a good Russian and then eventually a good Soviet. Anyone who was considered an enemy of the state got to go and hang out in Siberia for potentially the rest of their short life. So, in theory, the Communist Party was headed by a 5-man Politburo, but realistically, Lenin was the one who was making decisions. Everyone knew that. Because, who was going to argue against Lenin? It wasn't that Lenin was like Stalin later, where if you argued against Lenin, you disappeared. But most people respected Lenin. Oh, that would have been a bad picture to bring up with that comment. Most people respected Lenin because, he was the one who rolled into the Bolshevik Revolution and, took charge He was the ideas man. He had Trotsky, who was, in charge of the Red Army. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like he was a saint, but I mean, compared to Stalin, he was. But yeah, so Lenin was, the guy in charge. When you did speak out against the state or do things that were disloyal to the state, you were taken care of. And, they made sure that you were not found. This happened a lot. The gulags typically were work camps where you did work for no reason. One of the examples that I remember being told was building a railroad through Siberia. But it wasn't the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They had two groups. They had one group way up here at the front, like they were miles apart. One group at the front laying down rail lines. And then way further back was another group pulling up the rail lines. So they were basically building a line of track and tearing up a line of track just through the middle of nowhere. They were just working them to death for no reason. I mean, to work them to death was the reason. But yeah, like they weren't building a rail line to do anything about it. They were just making them work to make them work. That's what this is. They're not moving rocks to do anything with the rocks or clear anything for any reason. They're just making them move rocks. That's what the Gulag is. The Gulag wasn't like a concentration camp where they send them there to sit there and freeze in Siberia. The Gulags were a place where you go and work to death and also freeze in Siberia. So while the civil wars were happening, the Bolsheviks tried to use a policy of war communism. Peasants worked on collective farms and dissolved all private property. However, this met with massive resistance, but also mass starvation. Because removing peasants from their farms and putting them on big collective farms, turns out that doesn't work real well. Farms tend to work better when people are farming them and not like trying to work them like a factory. Collective farming tends to not work real well. Lenin decided to go with the new economic policy, also known as the NEP, where peasants could keep the land that they had seized during the wars, also expanded the private sector that allowed the economy to get back on track. This also allowed for artists and writers to express themselves in a Soviet cultural renaissance. I know I'm supposed to be going through this more quickly, but I took a class that taught a lot about this, and this is really neat stuff. There are a lot of movies that came out in this time period, and they're actually really good. Now, obviously, a lot of it is, Soviet propaganda, but like, it's so much into the mindset of the people at this time, of like, we are the spearhead of this new social experiment, and yeah, things are rough. Like there's always this tinge of like we're maybe gonna starve, or maybe we're gonna be hauled off to the gulags, but maybe we're gonna be like the greatest nation in the world. It's real interesting. Like early Soviet film is really, really astounding. I mentioned Potemkin before, which was an event that happened during the whole like Balkan fleet thing. And the film Potemkin was made during this era, and they used it as like propaganda of before the Soviet Revolution even happened. We had people like breaking the bonds of the Tsarist regime and blah, 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 and which it wasn't really like that, but it was a ship that mutinied because their officers like were feeding them maggot-filled bread, and which was not uncommon on Soviet or on Russian ships. But it has like some of the most famous scenes in cinema. That movie, and it's a Soviet movie. Particularly the Steppes of Odessa. Like, you can literally look up Potemkin, Potemkin, Steppes of Odessa, and it's like a 5-minute clip, and it's on YouTube, obviously, as old as it is, and it's this long tracking shot. It's people on the steppes of Odessa being shot by the Tsarist police, and this woman like trips, and the carriage with her baby goes down the steps as people are being killed around it, and you see it all go all the way down the steps, and then as it reaches the bottom, this cavalry officer on the back of a horse like swings his saber down, presumably, doesn't actually show it, but the implication is like he even like kills the baby because the people in Odessa had helped the sailors on the ship, so therefore they were also seen as being against the Tsarist regime. So it's this whole thing. But yeah, it's real good. It's Soviet propaganda, but it's also technically a historical event. And cinematography-wise, like, for the time, it was doing new stuff that had never been done before in cinema. And, like, was held up as this new standard. So it was really neat. And I'm really going off on something else entirely, but, like, it's cool that this was a thing. Because when we think about, oh, yeah, the Soviet Union, they were all just, like, starving to death and waiting in red lines. Like, okay, that's not untrue, but like, they still did have their culture. So the new economic policy was supposed to be temporary, but Lenin died before he could end it himself. He died on January 21st, 1924, after several strokes. St. Petersburg / Petrograd was renamed Leningrad in his honor. And this is where things started to immediately go downhill. So there was obviously going to be a major power struggle over who would take over. A man named Yosef Vishenovich Jushkevili from Tisvi, Georgia, outmaneuvered or purged, which is to say violently murdered and disappeared those that were his rivals, and came out on top in 1927. Now, that's a big, awful name. This is Stalin. This is Joseph Stalin. That's his chosen name, which means Man of Steel. And certainly not the Man of Steel we think of. This is more like as cold as steel, and as ruthless as steel, and as perhaps sharp as a steel knife, because he would slit your throat. He had many talents for a revolutionary. He could organize bank robberies, debate the finer points of Marxism, and he knew how to get away from Tsarist police forces. He also apparently spent time in a Tsarist gulag, because again, gulags weren't new. He had been caught by the Tsarist police forces and spent some time in a gulag, so he knew how they went, and was more than happy to send people to them. He was also ruthless and dedicated to the communist cause. In case you didn't get the whole ruthlessness thing from previous descriptions. He was also the least favorite of Lenin's potential successors. Lenin saw in him the sort of ruthlessness that would throw away lives. And boy howdy, Lenin was right about that. However, Stalin made sure his propagandists didn't include that in all his pictures, because here we have Papa Stalin with all these children. It's like, oh yeah, Stalin's a great guy. He's totally not like murdering our parents or having them just like disappear into the gulag. Stalin always looked like this, you know, kindly figure. I don't know if I have the picture. I think I mentioned it to you guys before, where there's the picture of Stalin standing next to, I think it was one of his officers, and then there's that identical picture beside it, but the officer's gone. And it's, obviously this was before Photoshop, but back then you could still edit photographs. And he had that officer disappeared for some perceived disloyalty, and he made sure that they went back and made that officer gone from all the pictures that he was in. So it was as if he never existed. Stalin didn't play around. You not only disappeared, but it was as if you never existed. So Stalin put an end to the new economic policy, began his 5-year plan to make the Soviet Union an industrialized nation. But in order to have an industrial revolution, you need an agricultural revolution first. We are going back to like the 1700s in Western Europe. Because, yeah, you need an agricultural revolution in order to have an industrial revolution, but they haven't had an agricultural revolution yet. So rather than waiting for it to happen, they forced the matter with collectivization, which, again, was what Lenin tried to do, and that didn't work. So Stalin was like, screw it, we're going to do it anyway. They forced peasants and nomadic peoples to settle in large-scale collective farms, where to live, what to grow. They had quotas to fill in order to do away with hoarding and black market trading. Because, you know, it's you're farming for the state, not for yourself. This resulted in 13,000 riots in 1930 alone. Stalin proclaimed the party was dizzy with success and then quietly suspended collectivization for a little while. Because, you know, when things are going so well that everything's falling apart, you should, let's just back off for a little bit. Sounds a little bit familiar, but anyway. Yeah, dizzy with success. Things are going great. I really like this one with, like, Stalin looming over the trains. This was, like, Stalin. I think the idea here, obviously I can't read Russian, but the idea here was, like, Stalin overseeing the industrialization of Russia is my take on it. I don't know. He could be saying something else entirely. Oh, right. This is where the problems start. Anyone who did not meet the quotas were labeled as kulaks, which is tight fists, which, you know, is to say they're not giving in to the proper quotas. They're keeping money, or I guess in this case, grain, away from the country, and therefore are traitors. They were forcibly resettled to farms, factories, or sent off to gulags, you know, which is essentially death. 1931, Stalin took revenge on Ukrainian nationalists by setting quotas so high that peasants would be unable to fill them even if they sacrificed seed grain. So, let me, in case you're not aware of how agriculture works. So, when you harvest, let's just assume wheat, because that's typically what we're going to grow here. Obviously, you're going to have a portion of it that you make into, I would assume, bread, so we're talking about wheat. But there's a percentage you're going to keep back as seed, because the part of the wheat that you turn into bread is also the seed that you use to plant more wheat. And in order to have enough seed to plant wheat for the next year, you need to keep a portion of it for the next year. That's just how it works. Same thing with, like, potatoes, you know, in Ireland. Really, most plants, the part that you harvest is also the part that you need to plant for later, or at least has the part that you need to plant for later inside it. So there's always a portion of the harvest that gets saved for later. So what they're saying here is the quotas are so high that even if they gave the people collecting the harvest 100% of what they harvested, they wouldn't be able to meet quota. And that would also mean they would have no seeds for next year, which would mean they would have nothing to grow for next year, which would mean they would starve. So in 1932, Stalin accused them of hoarding grain, which would be them keeping the seed grain so that they could grow food the next year. So he sent the Red Army in to confiscate grain from homes and barns. By 1933, people were dying at a rate of 10,000 per day. This is of starvation. You don't die of starvation quickly. Cannibalism was commonplace. Because again, this is a case of Stalin literally like, hey, you need to grow this specifically. You also have to give us 100% of it. Actually, no, like 150% of it. And then we're going to send the Red Army in to make sure you didn't keep a little bit of it to not die, and we're going to take it anyway. All the while he was exporting grain to other countries, nearly 9 million people in Ukraine starved to death because of his policy. So that's what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying that was worse than the Civil Wars, because the Civil Wars were people fighting. Granted, yes, a lot of those deaths were people that starved to death because of the wars, but that wasn't intentional starving to death. That was because of the war. Now, granted, people starving to death because of war is still like horrendous because it was a war, but this was on purpose. This was, I feel like, starving these people to death because they resisted the Soviet Union at one time. This is why the people in Ukraine are fighting as hard as they are. This is why when some jackass says, oh, hey, the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union at one point, I totally get why, I can't even remember the jackass's name, would want it back. Yeah, well, you know why Ukraine doesn't want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore? Because they remember this. I had a student one time whose mother was from Ukraine. And, she legitimately, she lived through this. She legitimately believed that Stalin was the devil, that he was Satan come to earth to try to kill her and her people. As much as Stalin and Hitler came to blows later, he looked to the stuff that Stalin did prior to World War II and was like, oh yeah, I can do this. Stalin certainly had a higher body count. Not for lack of trying on Hitler's part. I'm not going to be like, oh, Hitler wasn't so bad. But, Hitler was like, oh yeah, I like what this guy's doing. So yeah, 100%. And, of course, I've got images of children starving to death in Ukraine. Which, again, when you've got jackasses, and I'm not going to mince words here, being like, oh, well, Ukraine's not totally, blameless. They were the ones invaded. They were the ones who have gone through this in recent memory. Because, let's be real, the 1930s weren't that long ago. My grandparents lived in the 1930s. So, yeah, that's a quick thing on the Ukraine. And saying Ukraine / the Ukraine, it's interchangeable. The Ukraine is the region. Yeah. So when they say they don't want Russia there, they mean it. They've got historical justification for that. Meanwhile, Stalin wasn't just murdering Ukrainians. He was murdering basically everyone around him. He got really paranoid, started purging the Communist Party, which again, when I say purging, it's just like killing them. The party, the army, the bureaucracy, even his own inner circle. So even if you were like buddy-buddy with Stalin, you might just disappear one day, which I think is like where that picture comes from. It's just like this dude was like right there, buddy-buddy with Stalin, and then like either he said something wrong or he didn't, and something in Stalin's head was like, something about this guy, and he's gone. Leon Trotsky, head of the Red Army, was expelled from the party along with 1,500 sympathizers. Leon freaking Trotsky, the guy who's running the Red Army, Lenin's right-hand man, like the number 2 guy who got the Bolshevik Revolution going, was kicked out, which I can kind of see because Stalin was afraid of people who were buddy-buddy with Lenin, and he knew that Lenin didn't like him. So I get it, but also that's a bold move. By 1929, he was exiled entirely. By 1940, he suffered a lethal case of ice pick to the brain in Mexico. Stalin's agents followed him to Mexico and made sure he wasn't around to talk. That's what you get for being anywhere near Stalin. Which is why when we get to World War II and there's the meeting between the Nazi ambassador and Stalin, it's like I don't know which one should be more nervous, because a Nazi ambassador is immediately like, he's killed people. But he's also meeting with Stalin, and he's killed people. So it's like, which one's more nervous about the other? Because I feel like the Nazi should, weirdly enough, be the one that's more nervous, because he's in Russia. By 1938, 700,000 party members, many of them in the army, had been killed due to Stalin's concern or just anger about their autonomy or lack of loyalty. Once again, that's more people than we had die in our Civil War. And that's both sides. That's because, again, in a Civil War, every person that dies is of that country. And these are just people that he had killed. Some estimates put the number of people killed by Stalin, and this is, overall, including, of course, Ukraine and just in general, between 14 and 40 million, which, yes, is much higher than Hitler, which nobody really did anything about Stalin, is the thing. Stalin was able to pretty much go until he died. I guess because he wasn't invading anybody. Well, not until World War II. Just FYI, I got some more rough images here. People just left to rot on the streets. I think I've got, just stacked. And that was just how things were done. Okay, all that said, we do have a little bit of positivity. Vast number of peasants in the former Russian Empire got a little better wealth on these collective farms or working in cities. They had some access to education, so, a little better. The city dwellers experienced new technologies never before known to rural peasants, like electric lights, movies, and railways. Interestingly enough, one thing they never had in the Soviet Union, at least under Stalin, was radios. Because, do you know about this?
If you don't know what's going on, you can't do nothing about it.
Well, no, it wasn't so much that. Stalin was convinced convinced that radios could be intercepted in a way that people could listen in as much as hear. So he was convinced that they could be used to spy on him. So there could be no radios anywhere in Russia as long as Stalin was alive. So it wasn't so much the spread of information, although that was part of it. You are true. You are right. But like there were movies. I think there were even televisions once televisions became a thing. Now that of course was reserved for certain people. But like at this time in Europe, there were like radios like outside, announcing stuff. But Stalin refused because he was convinced that like the U.S. was going to be able to tap in and hear him and stuff. Also, kind of a silver lining, I guess, because there were so many high officials being just like purged, there was a lot of upward mobility because so many high officials were just gone. There were constantly seats to be filled. Now, that did mean that you were stepping into a very dangerous job. So you really had to toe the line. You had to give utmost loyalty to the party, even at the expense of neighbors, friends, and family, because, if your neighbors, friends, or family were at all seen as disloyal, you had to make sure that you reported them. Otherwise, if someone else did, you could be seen as culpable. So, and then you would be among the list of the purged. I believe it. I believe it. I believe it. I mean, considering almost every person that tries to run against Putin mysteriously falls off of a building or drinks some radioactive material somehow. Like, yeah, sure. Yeah, this 100%. I mean, Putin is definitely trying to remake the Soviet Union. Yeah. Yeah, I believe it. Yeah, to put it lightly, they had real good propaganda. I mean, like I said, some of the movies even, they are actually really good. Not just for the sake of propaganda, but there was one movie I watched when I was in grad school. I don't remember exactly. I think it was about the civil wars in Russia. It was depressing. It was about like, I guess it was this like teenage boy and girl that were sort of together. It was obviously that they were kids and they were sort of figuring out their feelings. But then the war happened, and so the boy was going to go off and fight in the war, and there was this uncertainty about whether he'd come back or not. And it's Russia, so it was always dark and gray and wintry, and it was a whole thing. Very melancholy. There was a lot of that. Soviet citizens were constantly told how much better off they were than the Tsarist Empire or the unequal capitalist regimes of the West, which, yeah, I actually talked about this just a minute ago in my American history class. When the Great Depression hit in America and the rest of Europe, it didn't really affect the Soviet Union because they weren't tied into the capitalist banks and trading systems. So for the most part, they weren't really affected. They weren't tied to the capitalist markets. So by and large, they were fine. Now, granted, they were like, compared to most capitalist countries, much poorer. But then all the other countries crashed, and like, well, see, we're fine. And of course, citizens born after the war were indoctrinated into the party. We have organizations like the Communist Youth League or Komsomol. Children and teens were encouraged to watch adults, including their parents, for any sign of disloyalty, which is terrifying. So you, of course, got these. This was weird. This is like 1960s Russia. Like, look at these mustached, like almost hippie-looking people, but they're Russians, like Soviets. It's so weird. That it's such a strange mix of like Brady Bunch aesthetic, but definitely not American. All right, a little more here. So yeah, we mentioned this our secret police. They were nothing compared to the Cheka. Um, which, by the way, our boy Putin was definitely a member of the Cheka um, back in the day, before he was a member of the what was it? Right before the Soviet Union fell, it was called something else, and then it's now also something else. But yeah, he was a member of the Soviet secret police. Um, any kind of complaining or other disloyal behavior, including falling behind in quotas, will be met with violence, as we have already seen. Many people called out their family or neighbors in order to be seen as a good comrade, receive better treatment by the party, or just escape violence. So again, if you just put focus on somebody else, you would be okay, hopefully. However, those who worked hard and were rewarded by the party, such as the coal miner Alexei Starkinov, who were collectively known as Starkinovites, were often resented and sometimes attacked by other workers for speeding up production lines. Starkinov, for example, being this coal miner, apparently was a really good coal miner and was able to produce really quickly. And so the reaction from the party was, that's really good. Now everyone needs to produce as quickly as you. And it pissed off his fellow workers. Obviously, this is why you have workers' unions. You need to set a good standard for workers, not whatever the fastest can do. Yeah, this is the opposite of workers' paradise. Actually, Stalin, you're missing the point of what a workers' paradise is. Actually, so that's a quick brief on the Soviet Union. At least prior to World War II. We'll look more into it when we get into World War II, but that's where they are. So that's good. We were able to get that done with time to spare. That took a little longer than I meant to, but it's really fascinating, considering they more or less came out of nowhere and became a major player in world affairs. So, back to Europe. France and Britain had a lot going on. Massive war debts, economic collapse, food shortages, issues with colonial holdings pushing for independence because, they were still colonial empires. Had to deal with socialist posturing, some right-wing movements, but they did manage to avoid fascism, which, is nice. Britain especially, there was no real support for fascism, but Winston Churchill, who was very conservative, was very visible and quite vocal. France, however, had a large left-wing union, the Popular Front, who worked to keep fascist parties out of power, so there was still some levels of rumbling in both Britain and France. But nowhere near what we saw in Russia and what we're going to see in other countries. So there's Churchill. He's finally grown into his hat. I love that picture of young Churchill in South Africa with that massive hat. So after the war and during the hard times of the Great Depression, there were demonstrations and riots. Push governments to do more about the failings of the free market because, the free market doesn't work so well when everybody's starving. So they didn't want to outright seize businesses because, the Soviet Union's right there. We don't want to do that. Lawmakers did listen to some demands to avoid revolution because again, there's the Soviet Union. We don't want to do that. 8-hour workdays were made standard in both states. Labour Party in Britain was placated with government-built flats to replace the squalid slums that workers had been subjected to. By the way, these flats burned down a lot, but we'll get to that later. Actually, we won't get to that this semester, but that happened a lot. I don't know why they're called flats. They're just like regular apartment buildings. I don't know where the word flat came from for the British, but that's just what the British call them. They created the modern welfare state, strong safety nets to prevent starvation, and keeping citizens from becoming extremists. So it's like, okay, the state is doing enough to keep you from dying, but also to keep you from, like, trying to overthrow the country. So that's good, I guess. Even though, at least in Britain, they're undoing a lot of that. Meanwhile, in the colonies, mandates and colonies started pushing for home rule, especially the colonials who fought and died for the Europeans. Especially one, Ireland. Irish nationalists declared their freedom in 1919, created the Irish Republican Army, which is by and large a terrorist organization, at least by British standards, which, I mean, anybody that says Britain's, you know, a terrible country, the British are like, oh, well, you're just a bunch of terrorists. But they did also, like, attack British checkpoints with, like, nail bombs and flamethrowers and stuff, so, you know. The British would have nothing of it. But by the end of 1921, the British called a truce. There was conflict. Like, they shelled Dublin from the ocean. The Irish physically fought the British after World War I. January of 1922, Anglo-Irish Treaty created the Irish Free State, but any counties that wanted to opt out could if they wished. The northern 6 Protestant counties opted out and rejoined the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. That's why Northern Ireland exists. I think because Northern Ireland was now more Scots-Irish than Irish, so they were largely Protestant, and they were therefore more closely tied to England than the rest of Catholic Ireland. By 1922, Egypt was free of England. In 1932, Iraq was free of England. Not all groups wishing for independence were honored, though. We had Mahatma Gandhi in India and Thein Sein in Burma were ignored, just to put it more simply. And again, that's something that you could go on for nearly a semester. French, Dutch, and Spanish colonies revolted as well. Oh yeah, here we go. This is Dublin. This is the capital of Ireland, having been shelled from the ocean by British battleships because they were rebelling. And again, this is like right after World War I ended. And here's the Irish Republican Army, a bunch of lads with their rifles, ready to go to war against the British. Oh, he's ready for it. He knows he's about to shoot some British. He's probably shot some British already. Here we have the IRA marching. They got a dog running around. I actually saw several IRA tags, just like spray painted symbols while I was in Ireland, both in Dublin and in on the campus I was on in Maynooth. So yeah, they're around. In fact, when I was in Ireland, the Queen came to visit, which was not something that normally happens. And there was a bomb threat on like the bus line that came through our little village. So it was like, oh, don't go on the bus. There's a bomb threat. I'm like, man, I'm just asleep in my dorm. I don't care. That ain't bothering me. I ain't gonna go try to see the Queen. I know what's. I know enough Irish history to know not to try to go see the Queen in Ireland. Obviously, nothing happened to the Queen in Ireland. She died of old age, or maybe the corgi got her. I don't know. But yeah, again though, I know enough Irish history to know that if the Queen's in Ireland, you don't go see the Queen because something might happen. Also, though, while I was in Ireland for 4 months, right? The Queen came to visit, and Obama came to visit. There was a lot of foreign dignitaries in Ireland for the 4 months I was there. Also, I remember apparently there was this whole big snafu where the presidential limo was going over a bump and got stuck because it was, I guess, too long, and the middle of it got caught on the bump. It was very funny. All right, a little more so that I can try to do World War II next time. A lot of these interwar democracies were looking towards military men for stability. Some countries gave up their democracies while others were toppled by force. Some countries were toppled to get rid of corruption and civil strife, like Poland and Spain. Others took on authoritarian models, which is to say, fascism. This was named after the Latin term fasces, which is the bundle of sticks tied around an axe, which is the symbol for authority and power in Rome. This put authoritarian leaders into power with the support of the masses. It is technically a legal overthrow of power. Going back to ancient Rome, this is sort of similar to the dictator thing, which again was a good thing in ancient Rome, where the government's not moving fast enough, there's a crisis, and we're going to put one dude in charge for a limited period of time, give him basically all the power, and he's going to make stuff happen. And that's a decision that the government makes. And that's what this is based on. But obviously, it doesn't go that way. So, similar to the communists, fascists pushed past any sort of democratic means once they were in power, and sought to get things done, so the people supported them, because again, this was the search for stability. This was this idea of these people are going to get things done, get us stability, get us food, get us land, etc. Let's overthrow this old way of doing things and put these people in power. We had the Third Communist International, known as the Comintern, sent out agents to spread the ideals of communism around the world, while communist and fascist nations were becoming aggressively expansionist, which is soon going to become a problem. Both communism and fascism are against liberal democracy and capitalism. They themselves are diametrically opposed. If you have a line graph, just like a single line, communism's on one side, fascism's on the other, and liberal democracy and capitalism's in the middle. We always feel oh, well, capitalism and democracies, we're on one side and communism and fascism's on the other. No, they're opposite. They hate each other way more than they hate us. Which is why in World War II we ended up working with the Soviets, because they hated the Nazis way more than they hated us. And the Nazis happened to be in the middle. If geographically it was different, we might have worked with Hitler. Who knows? So, for example, the communists saw class as one's defining factor, overriding national, ethnic, and religious differences. For fascists, your devotion to the state took precedent, allowing for religion and private property as long as it didn't interfere with the state. Why are you doing this to me? Okay. So yeah, that is one thing that, well, it's important for World War II. But as far as like the ideals of fascism and communism, they are so different. Um, they're we'll get to that in right here. Um, yeah, Italy actually, as I said, had switched sides by the end of World War One, so they were technically victorious, but they were angry that the Treaty of Versailles hadn't done more for them, so their communists began large strikes in March of 1919. So right and left-wing thugs started fighting each other in the streets um, and against the opposing party leaders. So like anybody middle of the road, which is to say like, Democratic or just regular liberal party leaders were completely ignored. This was communism and fascism literally taking to the street and going to war. Benito Mussolini, who had once been a socialist, decided to take power in 1919, reorganizing the Arditi into the black shirts, which were his shock troops. He decided fascism was the way to go for nationalism as opposed to classism, I guess. He was a charismatic orator. By October 1922, saves a march on Rome. The king capitulated and made Mussolini prime minister, which apparently was good enough. He named himself the leader, or Il Duce in Italian. 1926, he had the Pope sign the Lateran Accords. Wait, what? Oh, no, he named himself Il Duce in 1926. Had the Pope sign the Lateran Accords in 1929, which legitimized his rise to power and gave the Church Vatican City. The Church always has really, the Catholic Church always has really concerning ties to their property. Here is Mussolini. I will have things to say about him come World War II. On to Germany. Street violence in Berlin and Munich pushed the framers of the German government to the Saxon town of Weimar. That's why it's the Weimar Republic. A liberal democratic constitution was written, instituting a president, prime minister, and parliament. The parliament is known as the Reichstag. That's essentially their, again, the parliament is essentially their Congress. Nationalists saw the Weimar Republic as being full of traitors, subscribed to the stab in the back myth. Germany was not defeated on the battlefield of the Great War, but by greedy prospectors, which is to say Jews, back home who signed the treaty for their own gain. As I mentioned, the war never got to like Berlin, like it's going to in World War II. They just ran out of material and funds. They were like, yeah, okay, if we keep going, we're going to run out of men, so let's just go ahead and surrender and be done. But apparently there were a bunch of hot-headed assholes. They're like, oh no, he should have fought to the last man. Again, we have both communists and fascists fighting openly in the streets. Socialists were outdone by fascist groups like the Friedkorps, who were largely ignored by the authorities, who were more concerned about a communist takeover than a fascist takeover. So, when the authorities are more concerned about one group than the other group is going to end up in power. There is the Reichstag. Okay, we still have a little time. I'm trying to get through this as much as I can, but I spent too much time in Soviet Russia. Obviously, Germany was in real bad shape economically. The Weimar mark was devalued over and over, going from 4 in 1918 to 75 in 1921 to 7,000 in 1922 to the dollar, while still having to pay reparations. What this means is that over the course of just a few years, this is hyperinflation. their money is becoming less and less valuable while they still have to pay reparations to France and England. They temporarily suspended the reparations. France occupied the resource-rich Ruhr mining district. Miners were told to put down their tools and not produce for the French, which almost resulted in another war. Mark continued to devalue, 160,000 to the dollar in July of 1923, 1 million to the dollar by August. People would immediately buy food after being paid before the currency drop began. So you'd get paid and then you would immediately use all your money to buy food because who knows, it might drop again, before the next time you get paid. By November, it was 1.3 trillion Weimar marks to the dollar. People were no longer using the money, they were bartering for food and supplies. The money was basically useless. It was more economically viable to use the Weimar mark as toilet paper than to use the Weimar mark to buy toilet paper. Obviously, things were going poorly. And then we have an Austro-Hungarian, Mr. Hitler, refused admission to both art school, as I'm sure a lot of us know, and the Imperial Army, because he failed, I think, his physical for that. So instead, he went to the Bavarian Regiment and delivered messages between trenches. He also was hit in a gas attack and actually was in the hospital for the last bit of the war. So he didn't even fight in the last bit of the war. And in the war, he believed in the stab in the back myth. That was also when he... I'm getting ahead of myself. Joined the German Workers' Party in 1919, became the National Socialist Workers' Party, NSDAP, or the Nazi Party. Despite it being called the National Socialist Workers' Party, it wasn't socialist. I don't know why it was called that, but yeah, it was the fascist. It's the Nazi Party. It's the opposite end of the spectrum. Naming stuff's weird, but it doesn't mean it's the thing that it's named. I mean, again, it's the People's Republic of Korea. It's not a People's Republic. It's North Korea. They appealed to former soldiers, not afraid of violence, developed its own version of the black shirts, the stormtroopers, because, George Lucas wanted to be really obvious when he named the bad guys. But some people are really media illiterate. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. Recruited heavily in Bavaria, picked up steam as hyperinflation and his speeches took hold. So there is Mustache Man. Actually, do I have the... Oh, I do! There it is. I have that awful GIF. Anyway, okay, let's move on. That's a nightmare. Let's at least get through the beer hall pooched. He wanted to emulate Mussolini's march on Rome. He and 600 SA men surrounded the beer hall in Munich, kidnapped the governor of Bavaria. Because apparently the governor of Bavaria was just having a beer, and suddenly this dude grabs him. They wanted to get him to join with them. Obviously, the governor of Bavaria wanted nothing to do with this. Bavarian army put down the uprising. Hitler cooled his heels in prison for 8 months, where he wrote his semi-autobiography, Mein Kampf, which is, I believe, My War, is the translation. He articulated the main points of Nazism and pretty much his whole plan for World War II and the awful stuff he was going to do. Weimar Republic was stabilizing thanks to the American-made Dawes Plan. French out of Ruhr territory gave the Germans loans to repay the French and British, who could then use them to pay the Americans. Also, the loans could be used for the Germans to gradually rebuild their economy in addition to paying off the British and French. So here's Hitler and the boys, Ludendorff, Wagner, Rome. Quite a few of these guys. Well, Rome doesn't stick around. I think that will do it. We'll finish this up and try to do World War II on Wednesday. And then we'll do the review next week. So, see y'all Wednesday.